Hello, my name's Paul Bains, and I'm going to talk to you today about my encounter with John Deely and the relationship between his work and a relatively unknown tradition of neurobiology based in Argentina. I'm fairly certain that the topic I'm going to deal with is relatively unknown within the semiotic community and in the broader academy. So let's get started. I met John Deely in Dresden in 1999 at a semiotics conference, together with Kalevi Kul from the University of Tartu. At that time, I was completing a thesis which dealt significantly with some aspects of John Deely's work. And I'd like to read from his review of that book, which was published as The Primacy of Semiosis and an Ontology of Relations by the University of Toronto Press. John Deely was quite instrumental in helping getting that book published. He wrote a positive review for the press and helped me with the chapter subtitles. So here, to give some background to the topic I'm going to be discussing, is some of his review from the Review of Metaphysics. Here he is talking about the primacy of semiosis. This is a book rather to be read than read about, for the tale that it tells, in brief, compass is astonishing. Relation as a feature of the mind-independent world, affirmed by Aristotle and Aquinas, but denied by Occam and the moderns. Bains here presents, in the light of Charles Peirce, as Poinsot before him came to see it, as the one mode of being which is unaffected intrinsically by the surrounding circumstances which make the relation in question belong primarily to the mind-dependent or mind-independent order, and hence as the one mode of being which makes communication possible in the first place, and real whenever it occurs, regardless of whether the communication in question bears upon a being as real as Napoleon or as fictional as Hamlet, or any objective mixture of reality and fiction in between. This notion of relation as irreducible in its proper being to the division between the real and unreal, the mind-independent and the mind-dependent, is what Bains calls ontological, and he presents this singularity as the opening whereby semiosis, or the action of signs, as involving relations, irreducibly uniting three terms, enters and permeates the order of finite being. And it is the recognition of semiosis that marks the frontier and divide, at least within philosophy, between thought that is merely modern, however advanced, and irreducibly postmodern, by restoring reality to the knowable without reducing reality to what is independent of mind, which was the original point of the contrast between ens reale and ens rationis, for example, in the Latin age. Perhaps because he comes to the problem with no specialist background in scholasticism, and I would emphasize here that I do have no specialist background and have never held a permanent position in a university, or Thomistic thought in particular, Bains astonishingly treats the Latin noun of species, that is, of the forms which specify the awareness of animals, with a deftness and accuracy that completely bypasses the quo-quod fallacy that beset the whole of 20th century neo-Thomism. Now, I will just conclude this review by moving to his concluding remarks. This book deserves more space than is available for me for the purpose of this review. So let me say in general terms that Bains has provided in the area of philosophy the single most outstanding example I have seen of the ecumenicalism in semiotics that Professor Thomas Seebock constantly Semiotic, I should say, constantly called for. There is nothing on the market to compare with this book in its comparative scope. Modestly presented by its author, the work breaks open the dialogue most central to semiotics today in quite a startling manner. Bains manages to bring to the surface a thread of fundamental discourse whose breadth of commonality on the contemporary scene probably no one, certainly not me, heretofore suspected. I have long made the claim that the development of fundamental semiotics is the positive essence of what is truly postmodern in intellectual culture. But what Bains has done is to demonstrate that this thesis is implicit in a broad range of contemporary works, well beyond what I myself had occasion to focus upon. In doing this, he shows the need to revisit philosophy's whole history in a semiotic light, particularly the standardly neglected Latin centuries between Occam and Descartes. Now, I'll stop reading from that review now, and I'm going to move forward to the connection between John Deely's work and a relatively unknown tradition of neurobiology. And what some of you are probably going to guess before I explicitly make this one central point of this talk, I will read from this essay, which I have never published and developed some years ago. I called it The Really Hard Problem, the Mind-Brain Relation and the Argentine-German Neurobiological Tradition. So this is some of the ideas I put on paper about 5 years ago. Our ideas about the mind, psyche, or consciousness and its relation to the brain affect what we think we are as human beings and whether we are ultimately biological machines. And of course, the news today about, is it Google, I think, or this claim that a robot is now sentient and the engineer being put on temporary leave for making the claim is, of course, just another example of the relevance of these topics. Contemporary neuroscience remains largely at an impasse, claiming that somehow the brain must in fact generate consciousness. How the brain is supposed to do this is called the hard problem of consciousness studies. That is, how consciousness or the mind emerges from neuronal activity. Contemporary culture, as expressed in films and books such as The Matrix and Ex Machina, or the very popular BBC TV series Humans, often assumes that we could compress or zip our minds and personal identity into mathematical machine code or digital form and upload them onto the internet. Or that we could actually view another person's thoughts and perceptions through some kind of brain implant. The famous playwright Tom Stoppard wrote a play on the relationship between the mind and brain called The Hard Problem, performed at the National Theatre in London in 2015. Now, a virtually unknown school of neurobiology claims that many of the assumptions of Anglo-American neuroscience concerning the mind-brain relation are misconceived. How could it be that we remain so uninformed of such a rich tradition of mind-brain research and philosophical anthropology, the study of what it is to be a person, dating back over 100 years in Argentina? This school is based at the Laboratory of Electro-Neurobiological Investigations attached to Border Neuropsychiatric Hospital. The hospital is well known in Buenos Aires for its radio station, which is run by the inmates. Now, I'm just going to stop reading from this essay here to make what is, again, a quite remarkable connection between the Argentine tradition and the semiotic tradition based at the University of Tartu, where Calavi-Cull is based. The background here is that the person who established the tradition in Argentina is his name is Christ Fried Jacob. He was a student of Jacob von Uxküll, who taught at the University of Dorpat, which is now Tartu, and of course Jacob von Uxküll and others, of course, taught there as well. And John Deely was well aware, of course, and wrote extensively about the work of Jacob von Uxküll. So we have, quite unusually, a historical connection between this psychiatric laboratory and hospital in Buenos Aires and the University of Tartu, which is one of the world's centers of semiotic studies. In fact, Christ Fried Jacob was invited to Germany by a well-known Argentine psychiatrist, Domingo Cabred, and he arrived in Argentina in 1899. Now, I'll pick up the essay again here. The most important early researcher was the German scientist Christ Fried Jacob, who is considered the father of neurobiology and forensic histopathology in Argentina, where he initially worked. He held professorships of neurobiology at the Faculty of Humanities and established one of the most important neuropathological laboratories in South America. A key motive, apparently, for him emigrating to Argentina was the prospect of obtaining 300 brains annually for pathological study, when in Germany the corresponding number would have been 2 to 3 brains a year. And I think we have to bear in mind, of course, that historically and during the early decades of the 20th century, Argentina was a very dynamic and wealthy country. And it would not be surprising that these developments would occur there. Now, just going forward here a little bit in my essay, which was going to bring us, as I say, to this one point that I'm going to make, connecting John Deely's work and this tradition. In this school, excuse me, psyches do not emerge, rather, to use the terminology of the Argentine tradition, they eclose, just as in the eclosion or pop-out of microphysical particles in the indeterminacy ruled scenarios of quantum field theory. Psyches do not emerge from some specifying circumstance, but rather pop out, to use physics informal jargon, or eclose from undefinable circumstances. And their eclosion is cadacualtic. This is a Spanish neologism, cada cual, each one-ness. The physical antecedents or boundary conditions of what turns out to be their respective brains, which need not be human, do not determine which person will make use of its body and circumstances instead of those available to another psyche, availing of the brain next door. The most remarkable feature of these psyches is one that culture has ignored, namely every mind's cadacualtes, from the Spanish cada cual, each one, plus an added ending meaning, hood or ness. Cadacualtes designates the mind without consideration of its mental contents, excuse me, inasmuch as unshareable and unsubstitutable by any other mind. Before starting any development, psyches already differ among themselves. This being so, no common mental element, often reflected in a notion of consciousness, could exist. So now I'm going to leave those notes that I took and go more directly to a discussion of cadacualtes, and we will start to see how this relates to semiosis. I'm reading here from a document written by Mario Crocco, which is no longer available online, but all the notes here are from essays that in fact are available online at academia.edu, if one searches for Mario Crocco, and I'll give out those names later so we can all be sure of the spelling. So cadacualtes, or why one is not another. A technical concept of philosophical anthropology, and I reaffirm again that this is Mario Crocco's words, the specific discipline in philosophy that methodically reflects about what a person is, cadacualtes designates the mind without consideration of its mental contents, inasmuch as unbarterable and unsubstitutable by any other mind, also without consideration of its mental contents. Definitions. As a noun, in every consciousness, existentiality, psyche, soul, or mind existing in nature, cadacualtes designates that because of which such a psyche differs from every other psyche, even before starting to differentiate itself into mental contents. As a consequence, cadacualtes also designates the manifestation of the former as the constitutive determination of each finite mind that natural science finds in nature to both causally affect and be causally affected by no other parcel of nature, namely such and such a brain and its bodily and outer circumstances, than the parcel that, because of this determination, acquired the status that is called her. And some of you will guess where we're going now. On a relations-focused angle, cadacualtes designates the particular psychosomatic or psyche-body relationship constitutive of every one to sustain causal exchanges with a certain parcel of nature, one's body and brain, of course, rather than having one's existentiality instead enclosed in another brain or constitutive circumstance. A simple explanation by Mario Crocco. By denoting one's determination to sustain constitutive causal exchanges with a fixed parcel of nature, rather than one's existentiality having instead enclosed to another constitutive brain or circumstance, cadacualtes is a concept somehow akin to philosopher Martin Heidegger's notion of Gemeinigkeit, yet differing from this. The concept of cadacualtes assumes that in nature, a diversity of psyches is localized, for example, in the organisms of the human beings, dogs or apes, but not in mountains or pines, not either as a general subjectivity or world soul, a thesis that is called panpsychism, the view that all matter has consciousness. As it is widely known, the psyches, minds, or existentialities found in nature differ among themselves as they develop different inner mental contents. For example, each human being learns different things. A dog or a seal is acquainted with a certain person or has learnt certain abilities, while another dog or seal instead did not. There is no scientific doubt that psyches differ in regard to their mental contents, yet do they also differ intrinsically before starting to distinguish knowledges, that is, before beginning to learn? The question is important because if they did not differ intrinsically, it would be possible to think that mind or psyche is a common material, consciousness, akin to water or gold, from which samples are taken that afterwards adopt diverse shapes. Gold may take the shape of a ring or a coin. Water that of a drinking glass or a bottle, such a supposed consciousness, that of this or that cognitive development, to give examples. This idea of mental contents as not inseparably belonging, inhering to a particular psyche. Now, that widely known depiction is not the single one of its kind. Another portrayal points out that psyches are cadacualtic. That is to say, they are characterized on their cadacualtes. In other words, that before starting any development, psyches already differ among themselves. Things being so, no common mental element would exist. The reason is that mental contents inhere to a particular psyche and not to another. Hence, they cannot be disengaged out of such a particular psyche and, exhibited in a non-inhering condition, such as apple or rocks on a table. And no mind dust, after amassing itself into some conglomeration, could indifferently shape up one or another psyche, as it is thought in the views of numerous ancient thinkers, Stoic and others, William James or Albert North Whitehead. Cadacualtes, the intrinsic unbarterability, unrepeatability, incommunicability, and singularity of every existential being, thus manifests as the ontic determination in nature of every event of a finite observer's finding herself experiencing in a circumstance rather than instead in another. Natural science finds psychisms that neither self-posit to exist nor self-circumstance to a close, as their circumstancing is a constitutive contingency for finite observers. Its unbarterability makes such event one and the same, even if iterated observationally over the years, one never being shifted or teleported to other bodily circumstances. As a matter of observation, each real observer in nature cannot derive its own place from the physical regularities forming its other empirical findings, less to account for why the availabilities compounding his or her mental world do not become available to another person. Certainly, this other, in lieu of, say, the reader, could not detect any swapping, since, as mentioned, cadacualtes, although never predictable, is always post-dictable. But before it happens, that is now, other in one's lieu is fully understandable to everyone and serves here to illustrate what the pronoun who signifies, namely what is ciphered in the name. The variable indicated in other in one's lieu is what the personal identity means, alluded to in the function word who. Cadacualtes is the ontic determination of each instance of its being brought to bear, and before a particular existentiality closes to non-predicative actuality as a subset of finitude amongst a plurality of separated psychisms, the physical constitution does not suffice to determine who shall avail of the availabilities of a psychism. For example, at the time of the physical constitution of the reader's body, the components in the maternal makeup and paternal spermatozoa that originally composed such a body did not suffice to determine or even refer to who was to avail of the reader's apprehension, semovience, self-movement, and historical biophysical circumstances, including the species-specific palette of structureless characterizations stirred by her brain states, rather than the states of, say, a reptile brain, and the remaining of the reader's body providing its own time acuity for her existentiality to directly apprehend some bodily constituents. the particular set of all these availabilities to which an existential finitude, say the present readers, does not posit but encounters, is not available to another finite semovient existentiality. Cadacualters, a converse of ipseity, manifested as the eclosional circumstancing of finite noeses, which in each case make up their some respective noema, causing each finite's circumstancing to not another brain, is thus intrinsically asymmetrical over time. Now, I'll stop there and pick up what is the main point of this relationship between the Argentine tradition, and it is that each cadacualtic mind, psyche, or existentiality has a cadacualtic relationship with its body and no other. So let's look more closely at this and how John Deely brought this to my attention when I was no longer working in this area. This is from an essay that's available on academia.edu by Mario Crocco called, it's in Spanish, called Un Palindrome. Of course, a palindrome is something, in one meaning of it, is something that can be spelled backwards and is the same. I'm reading here from a basic translation of the Spanish. The center of each personal unit is by consequence a relationship conceived in terms akin to those of Paul Bains in elucidating what is to be understood by relationship in the primacy of semiosis. Now, of course, we could just substitute John Deely's name here for my name, akin to those of John Deely in elucidating what is understood by relationship, because basically in the primacy of semiosis, I'm giving an account of John Deely's work based itself on that of John of St. Thomas, otherwise known as John Poinsot. Crocco continues, it will then be useful here to give a brief overview of the work of our friend Bains, a semiotician currently in New Zealand, and in turn linked to the school of Tartu. As I pointed out, there is this connection between Christ-freed Jacob, the first German doctor to come to Buenos Aires, invited by Domingo Cabred, and there is even an essay written about the Argentine tradition, which has a picture of clavicle in it, which can be found again on academia.edu. Bains wonders how do things come to represent others outside of themselves. And he is quoting, how do things come to stand for something other than themselves? His research, is about the understanding of the ontology of relations. It requires describing the action of signs, but also the relationship between body and psyche is a relationship, one whose ontology is a fundamental constituent of each organism. And what is the ontology of a relationship, Crocco asks, and what do these kinds of relationships have in common, namely the signs and the psychophysical nexus? Based on the work of Deleuze, John Deely, and John Poinsot, Bains focuses on the fact that relationships are external to their terms, and it is aimed at achieving the ontological clarification of this possible externality of relationships. Bains develops the proposition initially formulated in the 17th century by John Poinsot that ontologically signs are relations whose whole being consists of its esse ad, or being toward, that is, your being towards. The psyche is constituted of the reader by his being towards his body or particular parcel of nature rather than towards any other. So what we find is that the unity of identity is in each case an inexchangeable relationship of an existentiality and a psyche akin to semiotic ontology. And this is Crocco writing in English. Is your mind also constituted by a being toward your body rather than toward any other? Might your changing body be also successively constituted by a being toward your psyche rather than toward any other? Is thus personal unity, that is, every instance of an existentiality body, an unchangeable relationship akin to semiotic ontology? So Crocco goes on to summarize, saying that this relationship shows how that between the cadacualtic relationship between a psyche and its body can be understood in the terms that are ontologically that a relation is understood by John Poinsot and John Deely, and he points out so that the term cadacualters, each oneness, can be explored through semiotic investigations. And I think that that is the single point that I wanted to make in this presentation, that we have, first of all, a relatively unknown tradition of neurobiology, which for historical reasons has not been widely appreciated by Anglo-American neuroscience and neurobiology. And now, for economic reasons, and also because the laboratory has been closed, the conditions are no longer readily available for its dissemination. But nevertheless, I think these materials are worthy of further study, in particular the philosophical anthropology of the Argentine tradition and its concept of cadacualters, or each oneness, maps directly onto John Deely's understanding of the ontological relation and being towards. So I'll leave it there, and I do hope that some of you feel inspired to look further into these materials, which, as I've said, can all be found on academia.edu, searching for Mario Crocco or Mariela Szirko. Thank you very much for your time.